the line of duty in the last 2 weeks, and our prayers and thoughts are with them and their families. But unfortunately now, the district attorney has made a decision, which is a terrible, terrible decision, in charging officers Keith Sandy and Donovan Perez with murder. There is not one shred of evidence to support any mens rea or any criminal intent on the part of Keith Sandy. To the contrary, Keith Sandy was following his training and very likely saved the life of a fellow police officer. I know many of you have seen the video of this incident, and I want to take an opportunity to put that video in context. We know several things. We know that on that day, Mr. Boyd had already assaulted 2 open space police officers with deadly weapons, knives. On a side note, Mr. Boyd's criminal behavior is extensive. He has carved up another person's face with box cutters. He has previously assaulted police officers, including the breaking of one of their noses. And he has been removed from a courtroom for his violent behavior. Now back to the mountain. Now back to the incident in question. At the time of this shooting, Keith Sandy was responsible for protecting the APD dog handler on that mountain. Mr. Boyd, who was clearly mentally unstable, unpredictable, and dangerously close to a defenseless officer while he was wielding 2 knives. He took a step with these 2 knives towards that APD dog handler. Keith perceived, and rightfully so, this as a threat to the officer's life. And therefore Keith shot Mr. Boyd to protect his fellow officer. Keith was protecting an officer in the line of duty and did absolutely nothing criminal. At this point now, because these charges have been filed, Keith looks forward to clearing his good name. I'm happy to answer any questions about this matter.
What has Keith Sandy said about the charges that have been filed?
He's extremely disappointed. Keith Sandy's been an officer for approximately 20 years. He's retired as a police officer. He spent his whole career in life protecting people. And the idea that he's charged with murder because he's protecting a fellow officer, you can imagine, that goes right to his core. It hurts. It hurts bad. But I'll also say this. Now that this is going to be a public preliminary hearing, he looks forward to the evidence coming forward. He looks forward to the entire public to know what happened on that mountain, to know what the situations officers face every single day, to know how they have to perceive a threat and then respond to that threat. He looks forward to that. At the same time, he's deeply hurt by this accusation.
If he's looking forward to that, why did you make the decision not to show up here today?
You know what? There's going to be plenty of time and there's already been plenty of attention when it comes to the media on this matter. There'll be plenty of opportunity during the preliminary hearing for us as his lawyers to present the case that we believe needs to be presented. It's not necessary for him to be sitting here next to me. He's hired me as an attorney, and I'll do that job for him.
Do you plan to participate fairly substantially in any sort of preliminary hearing? I know it's oftentimes common for the defense to stand back a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. In this particular case, we plan on participating by calling witnesses, and that's an interesting question. I'm looking forward, after my brief review of the report and the documents that I have received, and I know that I've not received them all, I'm looking forward to the DA's office presenting one single witness that says this was murder.
On what grounds can you state that he saved another officer's life, given that he was more than 20 feet away from the closest police officer and armed only with penknives?
First of all, that's not true. He was 8 feet away on higher ground with 2 knives in his hand from an officer that did not have a firearm drawn. The firearm was still in his holster because he was a dog handler. So there was an absolute perceived threat. I also would recommend that you do a little Wikipedia and look at the Tooler rule. The tool or drill is every single police officer in this country is trained in that. They're trained that with someone with knives within 21 feet of you can stab you and kill you before you could pull your gun and kill them. So absolutely, that person was 8 feet away is the evidence that I believe is supported. And I don't believe that this was a situation where any criminal behavior took place whatsoever. This was a job that Keith had, and that was to protect that fellow officer, and he did just that.
Didn't Heath talk about using force against Boyd right immediately after showing up on scene, and how do you kind of explain those statements?
Sure, there's been one statement in the media already, and I think one story in the media already, which says that he said he was going to shoot him in a private part. That is absolutely not what's on that recording, and I want to be very clear that that is not appropriate to continue to say that that was in that audio recording. To the contrary, he said he was going to shoot with a taser shotgun. Now, does a taser shotgun sound like lethal force? No, there's a reason for that. That's the mindset when they're going up there. They're called out there, Keith particularly, because that unit had taser shotguns. That's what's said on that. You don't shoot someone with a taser shotgun because you're premeditating killing him. That's not the case at all. Far from it. So, yes, he did mention that. That isn't a recording, but nothing to what has been reported thus far about what was said. That is an inaccurate description of what he said on that day.
Do you feel like what's said on that tape is able to be heard by someone plainly, that a jury would know what was said on that tape?
I'm hopeful, absolutely hopeful, that after it's enhanced, and that's one of the other things that we mentioned, this case is going about presenting a case. We plan on calling a number of witnesses, including experts. Some of those witnesses, I'm sure, will break down videos by less than a second per frame. Some of those witnesses will enhance audio recordings. Some of those witnesses will talk about training of a police officer and what goes through with that training. So there's going to be a lot of witnesses, but yes, we hope that we will be able to enhance that audio so that very specifically we can hear what was said.
And again, you want to get into this at the preliminary hearing?
We're happy to get into a preliminary hearing. He should not be held over under any probable cause determination. And if this is the choice or the method of which the district attorney chose to go forward to, the rules of evidence apply. We look forward to going forward to presenting that at a preliminary hearing. There's nothing wrong with that at all. We want to make sure the judge makes a fully informed decision.
Sam, do you think the timing is weird on this? The district attorney is facing charges herself, and then the charges in this were filed. Anything? Do you think that's unusual?
I'm not going to speculate to the district attorney's motivation in filing these charges or the timing of these charges. I think those are better questions of her motivation to ask her.
How likely is a change in venue if this goes to trial?
If this goes to trial, obviously with the kind of media coverage that this case has already garnered within the state of New Mexico, I anticipate there may be an issue as far as venue is concerned and whether or not to change that. But we hope at the preliminary hearing this case comes to an end.
This case has gotten national, even international attention, and I've heard, and I'm asking you as his attorney, has his life been threatened?
I'm not going to comment on that at this point. All I can say is that we look forward to getting this behind him, and we'll do so through the preliminary hearing process. I really don't have a comment on that.
Do you have
Will
any plans
Sandy
to
testify at
challenge?
the preliminary hearing?
That decision hasn't been made.
Do you have any plans to challenge the district attorney's standing to bring this before the court, given the fact that she is being investigated by DPD?
All issues of law are going to be looked at, and that's certainly one of them.
What about, I have to ask you this, who's picking up the tab for this? If he was operating in the scope of his profession, is he having to pay for his legal fees, or is the city?
Yes, he is paying for his legal fees.
He's paying out of pocket?
Yes.
Are you being paid by the city at all?
I'm not being paid by the city at all.
APOA?
I'm not going to address all the specifics of how I get compensated for this, but I can assure you that whether or not I was compensated a lot of money or no money, I would take this case gladly because this is a bad prosecution and there is no justification for it.
You spoke a little in your initial comments about putting the video into context. What do you think that people that have seen that video are still missing?
Well, certainly they're missing the first confrontation between Mr. Boyd when he pulls out 2 knives on 2 open space police officers. There's video and audio that will go into that. But I think once you see that video, you have to understand why different people are taking the steps they're taking. So I think that needs some context put to it, and I think there's some expert witnesses. Let's remember something that I think that is extremely important. The training that goes into being an Albuquerque police officer, Keith Sandy followed to a T. He did exactly what he's trained to do with a violent, unstable person with 2 knives, with uphill, 8 feet away from a fellow officer who doesn't have a gun drawn. Did exactly what he's supposed to do.
Do you feel like that fellow officer erred in letting that dog go? Because it seemed to be a somewhat static situation up till that point.
Listen, I will say this, and I want to make sure we understand this. Whether or not every single action, and I'm not commenting on that specifically, but whether or not every single action was done in the light of hindsight, 2020 hindsight, was done exactly perfectly as it should be, that is not what this case is about, and let's be clear. What this case is about is whether or not Keith Sandy had the mens rea, the criminal intent to commit murder. Absolutely not. There's not one shred of that. And the point is, when he made the decision to shoot the gun, was it justified or not? And that's where the focus needs to be. Whether or not other officers throughout the long hours and hours of dealing with Mr. Boyd did everything exactly correctly, or whether or not that can be second guessed and looked at a different way, that's not for a criminal proceeding. What this case is about is whether or not Keith Sandy had the mens rea, the criminal intent to commit murder or second-degree murder or manslaughter, and the answer is clearly no. There is no evidence to support that.
How do you prove that he didn't have criminal intent when hours before the shooting he says he was going to shoot for it?
Well, 2 things. One is we don't have to prove anything. It's the government that has to prove something. And that's a very important part of criminal law, and it's part of this country's founding all the way to today. But let's talk about that. He has been brought onto the scene to use less lethal force in a shotgun taser, which means they're going to try and disarm this man any way they can so that it doesn't get to this point. That's why he talks about that in advance. They ask him, what are you doing? Well, I'm going to shoot him with a shotgun taser. And whether or not that's locker room talk back and forth, there's no evidence of any criminal intent that I'm going up there to kill him. He didn't say I'm going to shoot him with a rifle. Didn't do any of that.
Can you speak a little bit to how much training and experience Sandy had?
Sure. Keith Sandy was originally a state police officer. He comes from a family of police. His father was a police officer. His father was wounded in the line of duty, was shot. Keith Sandy has had training through the state police and has had training as a lateral through the Albuquerque Police Department. And I think you'll find, and the testimony will reflect down the road at the preliminary hearing, that he followed his training exactly.
How many years was he with APD?
APD, I may be off a little bit on this. I want to say about 7 or so. I'm not positive on the exact amount, 7 or 8, but he has a total of 20 years protecting and serving his community.
How will these charges affect his law enforcement certification?
Well, that would be a question for the Law Enforcement Academy, but I'm pretty sure the answer would be that it will not affect.
Why did he make the decision to use lethal force instead of less lethal force? You said he talked about the taser shotgun, but he wasn't the one who fired that shotgun.
Well, at the time, once they're up on the mountain, and once that was down below, if you recall correctly. Once they're up on the mountain, what's going on at the time dictates what he's doing. At that time now, a canine had been put up there. His job transfers to protect that canine officer. That's why.
Can you talk more about his father, Sam? Was his father APD when he was shot in the line of duty?
I'm not. I believe he was Albuquerque police. I'm not positive on that, but he was shot years ago in a liquor store robbery, I believe. Yes.
Sam, can you talk about this, how this case fits into the national conversation that's happening right now with, Ferguson, New York, all that stuff? Absolutely,
and I do understand that, and I do. Anybody, and I think Keith Sandy would be the first to tell you that Mr. Boyd's death is a tragedy. Absolutely, and there's a lot of strong opinions not only on this case but on the cases across this country, and obviously we have to do everything we can to come together. And as I don't think it's any surprise to folks in this room, I've sued police officers before. I hold them accountable when they mess up. I've got one pending right now. But the fact of the matter is, this particular case is not a case to be some kind of example. This case is a bad decision to charge Keith Sandy. This case is not about race. This case is not about any of those issues. This case is about the use of force and whether or not it was proper or not, perhaps. But the idea that it was criminal doesn't even come close to that. And I believe that this was a very bad decision on the part of the DA's office even to do this. This case will, obviously, bring about a lot of emotions, and people who just view the video with no law enforcement background or training may feel one way or another very strongly, and I understand those feelings. But in no way is this district attorney justified in bringing these criminal charges.
But you've had people who have law enforcement training and experience look at this video and say, that's a bad shoot.
Really? Well, that could be their opinion. We'll see what the evidence dictates when it goes into a courtroom.
As I'm sure you're aware, the DOJ found that APD has a pattern and practice of constitutional violations, both in policy and in the actions of individual officers. You keep emphasizing that Keith Sandy's actions were within APD policy, but is he not legally bound to respect the Constitution even if APD policy tells him not to?
And Keith Sandy has respected and upheld the Constitution his entire career, and he did so on this day as well. And we are dealing with a fellow officer's safety, and that officer is alive. And unfortunately, Mr. Boyd lost his life. But when a mentally unstable, unpredictable, dangerous man with 2 knives is 8 feet on higher ground away from an officer who does not have a gun drawn, he is justified in protecting that officer and shooting that man.
Does Mr. Sandy at any point have any intention or desire to return to law enforcement?
Well, he had already planned on retiring. He retired exactly on the time that on his timeline, so I don't believe he does, no.
How likely is it that the charges will stick, that the judge will say that you have to take this to trial and not dismiss the charges?
Well, if you were to ask me, and of course I'm an advocate on one side, I'm not the judge, I would say that the chances are good that this won't go any farther. But I don't know. I don't know how that's going to end up. I've learned a long time ago not to predict the outcome. Human beings are involved in this process, so it's pretty difficult. So we'll just see how the evidence comes in, and we'll go from there. But I'm very confident and adamant about the fact that there's been no criminal act committed.
Sam, how unusual is it, you've been practicing law here for a long time, that the DA would take this to a judge instead of a grand jury?
Well, in light of the fact that she's made the decision to bring the charges, I'm not so upset with her for doing this process because it is transparent and I want the public to understand what happened here. So I personally don't find fault with the idea of going to a prelim instead of a grand jury proceeding. I do find fault with even bringing in criminal information to begin with of any type of charges. It is unusual. I know of other instances, though, in this county, which I've represented police officers in the past, that have gone to preliminary hearing as well. And so I don't think it's unheard of. It's not something done every day. But at the same time, I don't find fault in the process we're going through. I find fault in the justification of actually bringing these charges to begin with.
And how many shots did Keith fire and how many shots did Dominic fire? Do you know?
3 apiece, I believe.
Is it Keith Sandy's opinion that James Boyd, through his actions, brought this on himself?
It is Keith Sandy's opinion, as well it is mine, that Keith Sandy not only had the right but the duty to defend that police officer when he perceived the threat of that individual who was mentally unstable, unpredictable, and came at that officer with 2 knives 8 feet away. Absolutely. And he'd already assaulted 2 police officers before on that same mountain with those knives. Yes.
What are your thoughts on the judge who's been assigned to the case?
I don't give thoughts on judges one way or the other. I learned long ago that that's not a real healthy thing for me to be doing either. But I have no problem with the judge that's been assigned.
Do you anticipate anyone hearing from Keith Sandy before the date of the preliminary hearing? Does he have plans to talk, to tell his side of the story? Or is
Other
that
than
happening
me,
on
no.
that day?
I plan on, and we visit a lot, Mr. Sandy and I. Keith and I have been in constant communication. Obviously, he's very well tuned into what's going on here and obviously very disappointed in this, but at the same time, now realizes this is another chapter. He needs to go forward and we need to clear his name. But you will not be hearing from him prior to this preliminary hearing. He will not be giving any statement to the media. We're going to allow that part of the process to take place in a courtroom.
Well, what is he doing right now?
Still not going to answer that question for the purposes of his own privacy and the amount of attention, both from the media and other individuals that this case has garnered. We're not going to discuss what he's doing right now.
You said he desires to return to law enforcement?
I did not say that.
Okay.
I said he's retired as planned. I don't have any indication that he desires to come back to law enforcement.
Does he have children?
You know what, we're getting into his personal stuff, and the short answer, I think it's, well, I'm not even gonna go there. I just don't know that that's relevant to the issues at hand, because obviously with the kind of attention this case has brought, we don't need to be going there.
What's next?
What's next is, this case, I imagine, will be having a preliminary conference to the preliminary hearing, if you will, and we'll be setting up a timeline and some discovery guidelines. We'll be doing some officer interviews. We'll be hiring experts. I don't know what the state plans on providing. I've read their entire police report. I don't know what witness they're going to be calling that's going to justify these charges. But we'll work through them and find out what everybody has to say, and we'll go from there.
When can we expect the preliminary hearing?
That's going to be up to the judge. The judge will set that. I do anticipate, though, with the number of witnesses and the experts that are going to be necessary, this is several months out.
So back up, because this is the first that I've heard about this, as far as the threats to the open space officers. That was, what, a timeline on this?
Several hours before when this whole situation developed, what it did. Two open space officers responded to the fact that this gentleman was camping up there, and that shouldn't be camping up there. They responded, and they were both assaulted with knives by Mr. Boyd. That's what started the whole call out of the various units, the tactical units. That's why at the time this finally happened, there were so many different officers up in the area. It was because this wasn't, let's be clear about this. This case did not develop because someone was camping without a permit. This case developed the way it developed because this man, Mr. Boyd, pulled two knives on two open space officers and threatened them. That's why all the other officers responded. That one in itself was an aggravated assault on a police officer. Those are felonies. Those give every right to the police officers to respond, in other words, to get a handle on the situation. And unfortunately, because of the nature, there's a lot of police officers that went up for that.
How can you be so confident that Mr. Boyd committed felonies when he has obviously seen no trial and has not been convicted?
Because it's clear based on the officer's testimony pursuant to this case and the video audio of his confrontation where the cops are yelling at him to put down the knives at the very first contact.
Sam, are you saying that there mistakes were made that led up to the shooting? Is that?
I'm not saying one thing or another. I'm not judging the entire conduct of the police department in this matter. That's not my job in this case. My job in this case is very specifically representing Keith Sandy on some unjustifiable charges now that have been brought against him, and specifically murder, second-degree murder, or manslaughter, which I do not believe there is any evidence showing or establishing mens rea or criminal intent. There just isn't at the time that he made the decision to shoot.
When you say these open space officers were assaulted with knives, were they cut to the point where they were taking away ambulances, or what was their?
Assault and battery, two different things. Assault is this. I'm going to stab you, or I'm going to. Battery is actually doing it. Aggravated battery would actually be doing it.
If that was such a concern, why didn't they go up there and take care of the problem immediately? Why was there
They were up there.
this long standoff? Why was there this quick progression from flashbang to taser shotgun to dog to lethal fire?
So those are questions that you probably need to pose to the people in charge of the deployment of the police department at that time. Those are, Keith Sandy's following his instructions specifically and doing what he's supposed to be doing. He did not make the decision to call himself out to the scene. He was called out to the scene, responded to the scene. That's what Keith did.
There's been a lot of stories and attention on his left state police, why he had left to move to APD. Can you explain that? Because
I'm not sure I understand.
There's been a lot of criticism of what happened while he was a state police officer.
Okay, I don't know specifically who's criticizing or what they're specifically saying, but Keith Sandy was a police officer who has been recognized in the past for his good work as a police officer, and there was nothing pending or anything like that against Keith Sandy when this all transpired. To the contrary, and he retired with full benefits. So I'm not I don't speculate as to what somebody else might be thinking.
What would you say his mood is right now, Sam? If you-
I think his mood is sad that this has gotten to this point, but at the same time, I think now, as Keith is, he's someone who gets back up and recognizes what's at hand, and he in some way looks forward to the ability to clear his good name in an open, transparent process.
How was he charged? Was he served papers or arrested or what?
No, he is, the criminal information was filed, the district attorney's office is not planning on making any kind of arrest, they are not planning on making any kind of perp walk, they're not planning on making him check himself in, there is none of that going on. I was given the criminal information, the same as all of you, this morning, and that's where we stand at this point. After the preliminary hearing, when he's hopefully found not held over, then that'll be the end of it. If he is found to be held over, at that point, I think he has to do a book and release. But I hope and I don't think that we'll come to that point. Okay? I'm very grateful for you all coming. I appreciate it. If you want any follow-ups, feel free to call me. I think you all know how to get a hold of me. Okay, thank you very much. Yes?
Okay, real quick, are you working at all with the attorney for Dominic Perez? We're just trying to get a hold of him, so we just want to make sure.
His name is Louis Robles.
Right,
And
okay.
I've talked to him numerous times. So
Okay.
I'll let him know that people.
He knows, we've all been calling him. I just wasn't sure if he said anything about what he's gonna do.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I can't control other lawyers returning your phone calls. That's something I'm not going to do. Okay?
Can I ask about how much his legal defense
No.
would cost?
No. But you can ask, but you're not going to get an answer.
Is it typical that the city don't they usually pay for legal defense?
I'm not aware of the city paying any criminal fees. No. I'm aware of
Even
the
if it's in
city.
the scope of their, they don't
Not
pay?
aware of that, no. I'm aware of them funding, you're providing defense on civil cases.
Okay.
So you think Perez is gonna have to pay his own lawyer too, not the city?
Yes.
So they both are paying?
Yes. Yes.
Is this the first case that's been done like this? Like, I know that it.
Not the first one, I'll give you an example.
Cells, right?
Andrew Gallegos, years ago, who was a police officer accused of being the person that ran over somebody outside of the, what was the name of that bar?
Oh, yeah.
Sidewalk. She was accused of that. That went to preliminary hearing. Judge Murdoch did not hold him.
Okay,
As an example.
cool.
So then, that was the.
Not 10.
Is it away?
Eight?
Ish.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be the south side.
Yeah, I'll get it. This one?
Thank you all for coming out. Call me if you need anything else.
Spell men's red.
Mens rea. I'm gonna guess it's
M-E-N-S.
mens rea.